All right, students, this is lecture 1 of our unit on early history and storytelling in West Africa. So, how you doing over there? Right over here. Hey. So, let's take a look here at our notes to begin with. So, like I told you in class, all the science shows that Africa is where early human life began. All the evidence we have scientifically shows that life started in Africa. And if we look on here, early life started in Africa in this region right here, which would be called the Horn of Africa. Now, that would include modern day countries like Kenya, Tanzania, Ethiopia, and that's where the oldest fossils have been found. So when I'm saying like early life began there, that is where life begins, in the Horn of Africa. Right around here you can see Horn of Africa or Eastern Africa. And human life began about 200,000 years ago there. And what happens is, basically, life begins here. And for the first 130,000 years of human existence, we as a people only live in Africa. It's not till 70,000 years that people even start leaving Africa, and they start going places like Europe, they start going to Asia, eventually Australia. And this one's a bit controversial, and there's evidence against it, evidence for it, that we crossed over the Americas, possibly on a land bridge, possibly on boats, although some people even think it's possible that people came to the Americas from Polynesian, from islands on boats all the way throughout here, which is a possibility. So, what we need to know is where Africa is where human life begins, and the scientific evidence, all the oldest human bones that we have found are pretty much located in Africa. So if human life began in Africa, what was life like before that? Well, there weren't humans, and modern humans, basically we know that there were modern humans 200,000 years ago. That's when modern Homo sapiens, that's humans like you and me, really started. Before that, we were, as we had talked about in class, there was species like Homo erectus. And again, how do you remember Homo erectus? Homo erectus was the first one to go from 4 legs to 2 legs, or the first one to get up. I'll let you think about that for a second. All right, so there was Homo sapiens, which again, 200,000 to 1,000,000 years ago. We're kind of guessing a little bit on there, but we know 200,000 years ago, the evidence shows that there were modern humans. And again, if we look at it, the first 130,000 years, we are only in Africa. So that means for the first 130,000 years, or 65% of humanity, we were all Africans. Which again, pretty much means that we were all Africans living here. That means that we were black, and then we migrated out to other places. Best inference on that one for people like Europe, it's like, well, why am I not black today? This is my inference with some science behind this, is that we do evolve and we do change. And what happens is, if you were in an area where the climate would be different, could you lose skin tone? Could you lose melanin, which is the basically what's in your, melanin is what makes your skin darker. And having darker skin is a genetic advantage. It's an advantage to have darker skin, not a disadvantage. There's no real genetic advantage to having lighter skin. Not really. I mean, I'm going to get sunburned fairly sooner than almost everyone in my class because I have lighter skin. So that is a possibility, again, of what happened throughout evolution as people changed and went to different areas. So the whole point of this is to say Africa is where humanity starts. We lived there for most of human existence, and we didn't start as people. We do believe in evolution. We're going to use science for that. This is a class that I'm going to teach in a secular way. But there is evolution, and the evidence that shows that we evolved eventually from other animals, from apes, basically into modern Homo sapien humans 200,000 years ago, and then we spread throughout all these continents and to the modern places of where we live today. So, Africa is where human life begins, and then we spread out. So, let's move on to our next part. By the way, on this video, you'll want to go to my website, students, and you will want to check out the videos from Cosmos, from Neil deGrasse Tyson, where he talks about how evolution works. You can see how evolution works with animals like dogs, and we'll get to that here in just a bit. You also want to watch the Jared Diamond video where from Guns, Germs, and Steel, where he shows basically what life is like for hunters and gatherers today. And those aren't African hunters and gatherers. That's from New Guinea and Asia. So let's look at our next one. What are African hunter-gatherer societies? And I really could just make this what are hunter-gatherer societies. There's some in Africa and there's some in other parts of the world too. So hunter-gatherer societies were basically how we lived as humans for most of human history. We don't start living until civilizations, like we talked about earlier, like Mesopotamia and Egypt. We don't start living in civilizations like that until about 12,000 years ago or more. So before that, we're not living in these like civilizations so much. 12,000 is an estimate for a number. Before that, we were living as hunters and gatherers. So for like 95% of human history, we are hunters and gatherers. And what do hunters and gatherers do? They hunt and they gather. How do they do that? Check out the Jared Diamond video where it'll show you more descriptive, where you'll be able to see it on that. You can do that right now if you want. I'll give you some explanation too. Many archaeologists and anthropologists believe that most of the men were hunters and the women were gatherers. Some people dispute that though, and they say this was not clear-cut men hunting, women gathering in all cases. There are exceptions and there are differences. But there is a belief that men were the hunters and women were the gatherers. Some people accept that, some people don't. So the hunters obviously would hunt an animal, kill it, eat it, it's where you get a lot of your protein. And the gatherer would gather things like, again, the Jared Diamond video, Guns, Germs, and Steel. Wild sago would be one thing that came from trees. Berries, other things that you could find that, would kill you, you could eat. Gathering was actually more work, more intensive, and took more hours than hunting did. But what I want to tell you right now, and this is really important, is don't think of hunters and gatherers as inferior or less intelligent. They most definitely were not less intelligent. For example, I'll take out my phone here. It'll take a minute. I don't have the coolest phone. I got an LG because it was cheaper. And I have no idea how this thing works. I know there's a satellite up there somewhere that gets me internet and things like that, and I can talk to people. Could I make one of these? Not a chance. I have no idea. If you gave me all the materials to make it, I couldn't make this. I can't tell you how this thing works. I have this little computer in my pocket that I can say, hello Google, and it'll tell me things, and I think that's pretty cool. It's an awesome invention to have, but it doesn't mean I'm intelligent because I have one. Does that make sense? Now, hunters and gatherers in the past knew a lot more about their life around them, how to make things, how to build things, than I do. A hunter and gatherer, you could drop them off in the woods and they're going to make a shelter, they're going to be able to get food, and they're going to be able to make it. Me, not so much. They have a different kind of intelligence than I've developed. I've developed an intelligence to live in our modern world, not in a hunter-gatherer society. They've developed their intelligence to live in a hunter-gatherer society. And it's not easy to hunt, especially with the weapons that they're using. But let's talk about how they lived. So hunters and gatherers are living in tribe sizes to about 10 to 100. You really can't live in a group much bigger than that because they're not storing food and you have to be able to eat people. You can't get large amounts of foods by hunting and gathering. So they live about 10 to 100 people traveling in kind of like an extended family. If they had to marry, oftentimes one hunter-gatherer group would meet another and they would exchange brides or exchange people to get married, and they could continue living. There are some hunter and gather groups today, like Efe, who live in the Democratic Republic of Congo. So there are some today. Some are in Africa, some are in Asia and other parts of the world. These groups did start some domestication, but not much. Domestication means basically kind of like putting either an animal or a plant under your control. They were able to domesticate dogs. Check out the video on Cosmos where Neil deGrasse Tyson explains this really well because he's smarter than me. So check that video out, watch it, and it is pretty awesome. It'll show you how dogs were domesticated. But they didn't domesticate much else. They did not domesticate crops. They did not domesticate animals so much. They weren't like pastoral people who traveled with animals. They were hunting and gathering animals as they went. Now, the really good news about hunters and gatherers is they live pretty much a sustainable life. They can keep doing this forever, whereas our modern life, we don't make changes and keep living like this. Who knows how much longer we got. Anyway, we don't know. Maybe we make it, maybe we don't, but we tend to produce a lot of pollution and garbage and things like that, which, could really hurt us. You've seen WALL-E. Anyway, so that is basically how hunters and gatherers live, and that is how we lived for almost 95% of our human existence. Much of this was in Africa, but then hunters and gatherers spread outside of Africa. So when we look at the 70,000, these people that spread and start going to other parts of the world, they're hunters and gatherers. 12,000 years ago, we start developing our civilizations, and again, we talked about that in our earlier chapters on the Nile River Valley and Samaria, Mesopotamia with the Tigris and Euphrates, where we talked about the silt, mud, and the crops. Hunters and gatherers, they didn't do that. Okay? So let's move on to our next part of this lecture, and let's start talking about the beginnings of agriculture in Africa and the world. So let's talk about farming and domestication. So farming and domestication starts 10 to 12,000 years ago, roughly, and this becomes like larger domestication. This is basically someone takes the huge step that revolutionized life. They domesticate crops. The first crop that was domesticated would have really, one of the first ones would have been wheat, which was in the Tigris and Euphrates, which is up here in Iraq, and also in the Nile River Valley. So we see one of them happens in Africa, one of them happens outside of Africa. So, and also the one that's outside of Africa is not that far away. So when the people are migrating out here, they start farming. Now again, don't think because you're farming and building cities that you're more intelligent. It's just a different way of living. So basically what happens is about 6,000 BC, this is about 8,000 years ago, the Sahara Desert starts to dry up. Now what I'm telling you is kind of a theory because archaeologists and anthropologists, paleobiologists, and these smart people with long names, they've developed these theories, but we don't know if they're 100%. And if we find something new, some more puzzle pieces, maybe this changes. Maybe there's more information 5-10 years from now. So what happens is the Sahara Desert was not always a desert. About 6,000 BC, 8,000 years ago, this thing really starts drying up. So the desert starts drying up, and where are people going to go? It's harder to live here. There was grass, there were trees, there's been evidence of that that's been found. So they start, you can go south here into the Savannah area. You can go to West Africa, which will start some kingdoms later. The Bantu people start living around here. We'll talk about them in a little bit. You can go there to the Nile River. There's a big, huge river you can go live near. Or if they leave out here, they go to this area, which is also a desert, but they find these two rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates. Now, there is a theory that agriculture was started not because they wanted to, but because they kind of had to, because the food sources weren't around like they used to. So eventually they had to kind of try something new. So they tried putting seeds in the ground and growing them near the riverbeds. And we talked about that with the silt of the Nile, the silt of the Tigris and the Euphrates. And they move out to these regions, and eventually they start growing crops like wheat. Now in class, we also talked about how basically wheat was one of the first crops. They used it to make bread, but also beer, which is real interesting. They weren't just, getting drunk all the time. The beer was often had a high, had more calories in it and could give you the same nutrition that wheat could. And they would sit around it and drink it from a large, pot. Here's an image that I took from UCLA. UCLA, awesome school. Anyway, so here we see an image right here. That is a pot with some drinking straws on it, and this is where people would drink. This would be the beer. And they would also, have their bread. And it's actually debatable in history which one came first. Did they produce the beer first for them to drink and basically get their calories and, nutrition from? Or was it the bread? Which one was the product they were trying to make, and which is the one that was kind of like the one that came from it, the one that was also made at the same time? It's debatable in history which one came first. More people lean towards that bread was first, but there are historians who say no, they were actually trying to make beer. Some of the beer went to the priest, and they would get that, and I don't know if that had anything to do with when they wanted to talk to the gods, especially in Mesopotamia. Maybe that had something to do with it. But anyway, those are two things that they started growing crops, and they started growing agriculture. So they grow wheat. This goes in the Nile River Valley. We have up here in Mesopotamia. They move down to the Savannah, and they start other complex civilizations, and these also start in Africa. So we go from being basically, early people who are living, so we see back here to our lecture to review real quick. In Africa, human life begins there. We eventually leave Africa. We're hunters and gatherers for most of this time. Then 12,000 years ago, we start planting things, probably because we lived in a desert and needed food. And we grow wheat. We get bread out of it, and now we have civilizations. And civilizations happen when we domesticate crops and animals, and then we start living in cities around them.